There is a strange moment that happens when you finally stop making yourself available to everyone. The people who were used to getting everything from you suddenly notice that something has changed. You take longer to respond. You say no without giving a 10-minute explanation. You stop answering messages when you're exhausted. You don't keep arguing just to prove that you care. And sometimes, nothing dramatic even happens. You simply become a little less willing to abandon yourself for the comfort of someone else. Yet somehow, people start treating you differently. Some become more careful with their words. Some start listening more closely. Some suddenly seem to respect your time, and a few may even become distant. At first, that can feel confusing because you haven't become cruel. You haven't become arrogant, you haven't stopped caring. You've simply stopped allowing people unlimited access to you. And that is where one of the most misunderstood truths about human behavior begins. People don't always respect you because of how much you give them. Sometimes they respect you because they finally understand what you will no longer accept. Think about the people in your own life. There is probably someone who is always available. The person who answers every call, who forgives almost immediately, who says it's okay even when it isn't, who keeps adjusting their schedule, who listens for hours but rarely asks for anything in return. At first, everyone appreciates that person. They seem kind, reliable, understanding, but over time something subtle can happen. Their kindness becomes expected, and once something becomes expected, people can stop noticing the effort behind it. That doesn't necessarily mean they're bad people. It's simply one of the ways human expectations develop. When a behavior happens repeatedly, we begin to treat it as normal. If you always respond immediately, immediate responses become normal. If you always forgive, forgiveness becomes normal. If you always accept disrespect, and then return the next day as if nothing happened, people may begin to assume there are no real consequences for crossing that line. And this is where boundaries become psychologically powerful. A boundary changes the information people have about you. It tells them, this is where I stop, not through anger. Not through threats, not through dramatic speeches, just through consistent behavior. And consistency matters far more than a powerful speech ever could. Because anyone can say, don't treat me like that. The more revealing question is, what do you actually do when someone does? Imagine a friend who constantly cancels plans at the last minute. Every time you tell yourself they were busy, then it happens again and again. Eventually, you tell them calmly, I understand that things come up, but if plans keep getting canceled at the last minute, I'm going to stop making plans in advance. Notice what you didn't say. You didn't insult them, you didn't threaten them, you didn't demand that they become a different person. You simply explained what you are willing to participate in. That is a boundary. And something important happens psychologically when you communicate this way. You're no longer trying to control their behavior, you're defining your own. That's the difference between a boundary and a demand. A demand says, you must do this. A boundary says, if this continues, here's what I will do. That difference creates a completely different psychological dynamic because people can argue with your demand. They can tell you you're being unreasonable, they can try to negotiate, they can make you feel guilty, but it's much harder to argue with a person who quietly changes their own behavior. And this is one reason boundaries can increase respect. They show that your words and actions belong together. You aren't simply describing your standards, you're living by them. And people notice that, maybe not immediately, maybe they don't admit it, but human beings are extremely sensitive to consistency. We pay attention to what someone repeatedly tolerates. We learn where their limits actually are, and sometimes without even realizing it, we test those limits. Not always maliciously, sometimes it's simply part of social learning. Think about a child who asks a parent for something. The parent says no. The child asks again, then starts crying, then asks one more time. If the parent eventually gives in every time, the child learns something, not necessarily that the parent is weak. The child learns that persistence changes the outcome. The same basic principle can appear in adult relationships, friendships, workplaces, and social interactions. If someone discovers that pushing your boundary eventually makes you surrender, they have learned that the boundary isn't really a boundary. It's a suggestion, and suggestions are easy to ignore. This is why one of the strongest forms of self-respect is not saying no loudly. It's being willing to follow through quietly, because the real power of a boundary doesn't come from how strongly you announce it. It comes from what happens after you announce it. And there's something even deeper here. A lot of people struggle with boundaries because they confuse being liked with being respected. Those two things can overlap, but they are not the same. If your entire identity depends on people being pleased with you, then every boundary can feel like a threat. You say no, and immediately wonder if they're upset. You express a preference. And start worrying that you're being difficult. Someone becomes disappointed, and you assume you've done something wrong, so you apologize, you explain, you soften, you take the boundary back. And eventually, you teach yourself that other people's discomfort is more important than your own needs. That's exhausting. And over time, it can create resentment. Because every time you say yes when you mean no, part of you remembers. You may smile in the moment, but later you think, why did I agree to that? Why do I always do this? Why can't I just say what I actually want? That internal conflict is one of the clearest signs that a boundary may be missing. And boundaries aren't only about other people. They're also about your relationship with yourself. Because before you can consistently communicate a boundary to someone else, you have to believe that your own needs deserve consideration. That's where self-respect begins, not with becoming harder, not with becoming emotionally distant, but with finally treating your own time, energy, attention, and emotional well-being as things that matter. There is a quiet difference between a person who is generous because they genuinely want to give, and a person who gives because they're terrified of what will happen if they don't. From the outside, those two people can look identical. Both say yes, both help, both listen, both make sacrifices, but internally the experience is completely different. One is choosing. The other is afraid, and healthy boundaries help move you from fear-based giving to choice-based giving. You can still be kind, you can still help people, you can still forgive. You can still be deeply compassionate, but now, your kindness has a door and you decide who gets to walk through it. That doesn't make you selfish, it makes your generosity sustainable. Because when you have no boundaries, even your kindness can become a source of bitterness. You give too much, you feel unappreciated, you keep giving anyway. Then eventually you become angry at people for taking what you voluntarily kept offering. That's an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people aren't taking too much. Sometimes we are giving without ever communicating where the limit is, and then expecting them to somehow know. They can't always know, people aren't mind readers. If you constantly say, it's fine when it isn't fine, you can't expect everyone to understand the invisible boundary inside your head. This is why healthy boundaries require honesty, not cruelty. Honesty, instead of saying whatever you want when you have a preference, you can say, I'd rather do this. Instead of saying, don't worry about it when something genuinely bothers you. You can say that actually bothered me. Instead of pretending you're available when you're exhausted, you can say, I can't talk right now. I'll get back to you later. These sentences are simple, but for someone who has spent years trying to keep everyone happy, they can feel enormous. Because setting a boundary often creates a brief emotional discomfort, and this is where many people give up. They mistake discomfort for wrongdoing. But feeling guilty doesn't automatically mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional reaction that appears when you do something unfamiliar. If you've spent years putting everyone else first, then putting yourself on the list can initially feel selfish, even when it isn't. Imagine you've spent your entire life walking with your shoulders pulled forward. The first time you stand straight, it might feel strange. The posture feels wrong. Not because it's wrong, but because you're not used to it. Boundaries can work the same way. At first, saying no may feel unnatural. You might overthink the conversation afterward. You might wonder whether they misunderstood you. You might replay your words. You might even feel guilty for protecting yourself. But with practice, something changes. You begin to realize, I can disappoint someone without betraying myself. That is a powerful psychological shift, because mature relationships are not relationships where nobody is ever disappointed. They're relationships where disappointment can exist without destroying the connection. Someone can dislike your decision and still respect your right to make it. Someone can want more from you, and you can still say no. Someone can be upset, and you don't have to immediately fix their feelings. That's emotional maturity, and this is another reason boundaries can increase respect. They reveal emotional independence. When people realize that you don't need their approval to maintain your own standards, the relationship changes. You become less reactive, less desperate to be understood, less likely to negotiate against yourself, and strangely, that often makes people take your words more seriously. Think about someone who constantly threatens to leave a relationship but never does. Eventually, the words lose their weight. Now compare that with someone who rarely threatens anything. They simply make decisions. If something becomes unhealthy, they step back. If someone repeatedly disrespects them, they reduce access. If a relationship becomes one-sided, they stop forcing it. That person may say less, but their actions communicate more, and human beings tend to pay attention to consequences, not because people are always calculating, but because behavior teaches us what is real. A person can tell you, I have standards for years, but you understand their standards when you see what they consistently refuse to tolerate. That's why boundaries are not primarily about words. They're about patterns, and patterns are difficult to fake for very long. There is also an important misunderstanding about respect. Some people think that to be respected, they need to become intimidating, they speak harshly, they become cold, they stop showing emotion, they make sure everyone knows they don't need anybody. But that's not necessarily respect. Sometimes it's simply fear, and fear is unstable. People may obey someone they fear while secretly resenting them. Healthy respect is different. It doesn't require you to become frightening. You can be warm and still have standards. You can be gentle and still be firm. You can care deeply and still walk away from something that harms you. In fact, some of the strongest boundaries are almost boring. I can't do that. No, that doesn't work for me. I'm not comfortable with that. If you speak to me that way, I'll end the conversation. I need some time before we talk about this. That's it. No speech, no performance. No attempt to dominate, just clarity. And clarity is powerful because it removes confusion. When your boundaries are inconsistent, people have to guess where you stand. Today you tolerate something, tomorrow you're furious about it. One day you say no. The next day you reverse yourself because someone gets upset. That inconsistency makes relationships unstable. Not because you're a bad person, but because nobody knows which version of your boundary is real. Consistency creates predictability, and predictability creates trust. This is true in healthy relationships as much as it is anywhere else. Think about a friend who knows exactly what you will and won't accept. They don't have to wonder whether you're going to suddenly explode. They don't have to guess whether you're secretly angry. They know you will communicate directly. That's actually comforting. Healthy boundaries don't create distance. They create clarity, and clarity often makes genuine closeness easier, because when people know where you stand, they can interact with the real you. Not the version of you constantly adjusting itself to fit everyone else. There's another reason people may respect boundaries. Boundaries reveal that your attention has value. And attention is one of the most limited things you possess. You can make more money, you can buy new things, you can recover from some mistakes, but you cannot get yesterday's attention back. Every hour you spend is an hour you will never have again, yet people often give their attention away as if it were unlimited. They answer every message, join every conversation, accept every invitation, listen to every problem, argue with every stranger online, explain themselves to people who have already decided not to understand them, and eventually, they have no attention left for themselves. A boundary says, my attention is not automatically available. That doesn't mean you're important and everyone else isn't. It means your attention is finite, and because it's finite, you have to choose where it goes. This is especially important in the age of constant communication. A message arrives. You feel pressure to respond. Another notification, another request, another opinion, another argument, another person wanting something. The technology makes access easy. But easy access can create the illusion that constant availability is normal. It isn't. You are allowed to be unreachable sometimes. You're allowed to have a quiet evening. You're allowed to put your phone down. You're allowed to answer tomorrow. And someone being able to contact you does not mean they are entitled to an immediate response. That distinction alone can change the way you experience your life, because boundaries are not only interpersonal, they're environmental. They determine what gets access to your mind, what conversations you participate in, what content you consume, what behavior you normalize, what kind of energy you repeatedly expose yourself to. You can set a boundary with another person, but you can also set one with your own habits, and the more intentional you become about what enters your life, the more intentional you become about what leaves it. But there is a difficult part nobody talks about enough. When you start setting healthier boundaries, not everyone will like it, and that's important. Because if your goal is to make everyone happy with your boundaries, you will eventually have no boundaries at all. Some people benefited from the version of you that had none. They may not consciously realize it, but they were comfortable with your constant availability, your immediate forgiveness, your silence, your flexibility, your willingness to absorb inconvenience. So when you change, they may say things like, you're different, you've changed, you used to be nicer. Why are you acting like this? Sometimes they may genuinely believe you're becoming selfish. And sometimes, They may simply be reacting to the loss of access they used to have. Those are not the same thing. This is why you have to examine your behavior honestly. If several people tell you that you're becoming cruel, dismissive, or self-centered, it's worth reflecting. Boundaries don't give you permission to treat people badly. But someone being unhappy with your boundary doesn't automatically mean the boundary is wrong. The key is how you communicate it. Are you trying to punish them? Are you trying to control them? Are you trying to make them feel guilty, or are you simply protecting something important to you? That question can tell you a lot. A healthy boundary creates space. An unhealthy wall creates isolation. A boundary says, I care about you but I won't participate in this. A wall says, I don't trust anyone so nobody gets close. Those may look similar from a distance, but emotionally they're completely different. One is built from self-respect, the other may be built from fear. And sometimes people who discover boundaries for the first time swing too far in the opposite direction. They go from saying yes to everything to saying no to almost everything. They stop communicating, they disappear, they call it protecting their peace, but sometimes it's avoidance wearing the language of self-respect. Real boundaries don't require you to become unreachable. They require you to become intentional. You can still communicate, you can still compromise, you can still apologize. You can still admit when you're wrong. In fact, a person with healthy boundaries should be capable of saying, I understand why you're upset, without automatically saying, therefore, I'll abandon my boundary. Those are two different things. You can validate someone's feelings without surrendering your position. You can say, I understand that this disappointed you, and still mean, my decision hasn't changed. That is emotional strength. Because you are allowing another person to have feelings without making those feelings your responsibility. And this brings us to one of the deepest reasons boundaries create respect. They teach people that your relationship with yourself is real. When you repeatedly choose yourself in healthy ways, you send yourself a message. My needs matter, my time matters, my voice matters, my discomfort is worth listening to, my values are not negotiable every time someone disagrees. Over time, that changes how you carry yourself. You become less apologetic for existing. You don't need to fill every silence. You don't need to justify every preference. You don't need permission to rest. You don't need everyone to understand your choices. And people often respond to that internal change before you even say anything. Your tone becomes calmer. Your decisions become clearer. Your reactions become slower. You stop arguing with people who aren't listening. You stop chasing people who keep withdrawing. You stop trying to prove your worth to people who benefit from making you question it, and that creates something that cannot be manufactured: quiet self-respect. The interesting thing is, respect often becomes stronger when you stop trying so hard to earn it. Because the moment you desperately need someone to respect you, you give them too much power over your emotional state. You start monitoring their reactions. Did they like what I said? Are they angry? Do they still want me around? Did I make them uncomfortable? Should I apologize? Should I explain? Should I send another message? And suddenly, your entire sense of stability depends on someone else's response. Boundaries interrupt that cycle. They bring your attention back to a more important question: what do I believe is right for me? Not, how can I make everyone comfortable with my decision? That doesn't mean becoming indifferent. It means understanding that consideration and self-abandonment are not the same thing. You can consider people, you don't have to disappear for them. You can compromise, you don't have to betray yourself. You can love someone, you don't have to accept everything they do. You can forgive, you don't have to restore the same level of access. That's a distinction many people learn only after years of difficult experiences. Forgiveness and access are different. Understanding someone and trusting them are different. Loving someone and being available to them are different. And setting a boundary allows those distinctions to exist. Maybe you understand why someone hurt you, but you still choose distance. Maybe you forgive someone, but you don't give them the same opportunity to repeat the behavior. Maybe you love someone deeply, but you realize the relationship is unhealthy. That's not necessarily a contradiction. It's maturity. And once you understand that, boundaries stop feeling like weapons. They become tools for creating healthier relationships, because the goal isn't to keep everyone out. The goal is to make sure the people who come close understand how to treat the person they're close to. There's also something powerful about realizing that a boundary gives the other person useful information. Without it, they may never know. If you quietly become resentful but never speak, they don't know what needs to change. If you constantly say yes while secretly wishing you'd said no, they may assume everything is fine. If you laugh when someone crosses a line because you're afraid of conflict, they may believe the relationship can continue that way. A clear boundary gives the relationship a chance to become more honest, and sometimes, the other person responds surprisingly well. They say, "I didn't realize that bothered you," they adjust. They apologize, they respect it, and the relationship becomes stronger because now both people understand each other better. But sometimes they don't, sometimes they push harder. Sometimes they mock the boundary, sometimes they become angry, sometimes they disappear, and as painful as that can be, their reaction gives you information too. It tells you something about the relationship, because a person who only likes you when you have no needs may not actually be comfortable with you as a whole person. They may be comfortable with your usefulness, and there is a huge difference. You are not here simply to be useful. You are a person, you have limits, you have preferences, you have bad days. You need rest, you make mistakes, you change your mind, you deserve relationships where your humanity isn't treated like an inconvenience. And maybe that's the most important thing boundaries reveal. They reveal who is interested in you and who is mainly interested in what they can get from you, not always, but often enough to notice. When you stop overgiving, some relationships become quieter. That can hurt, but sometimes the silence is not a loss. Sometimes it's information. Because when the constant effort stops, you finally get to see what was actually holding the relationship together. Was there mutual care, or were you carrying most of it? Were they reaching out because they valued you, or because you were always available? Were they respecting you? Or simply relying on your inability to say no? You don't always discover these answers by asking. Sometimes you discover them by changing your behavior. Stop chasing. Stop over-explaining. Stop automatically fixing everything. Stop volunteering for every inconvenience. Then watch what happens, not as a manipulation, not as a test, but as observation. Healthy relationships usually adjust. One-sided relationships often reveal themselves, and that can be uncomfortable, but it can also be freeing. Because you don't have to spend your entire life convincing people to value what they keep taking for granted. You can simply become more selective about where you place your energy. And there's one final shift that happens when boundaries become part of your life. You stop seeing no as rejection. You start seeing it as direction. No tells you where your time shouldn't go. No protects a yes that actually matters. No gives your commitments meaning, because if you say yes to everything, your yes eventually becomes meaningless. But when you say no when you need to, your yes becomes valuable. When you help someone because you genuinely choose to, that help means more. When you spend time with someone because you want to, that time feels different. When you stay in a conversation because you care, rather than because you're afraid to leave, you are actually present. Boundaries don't make your life smaller. They help you decide what deserves the space you have, and perhaps the most beautiful part is this: the goal isn't to make people respect you. The goal is to become someone who respects yourself enough to stop negotiating against your own values. Respect from other people may follow, it may not. Some people will understand, some won't. Some will appreciate the new version of you. Some will miss the version that was easier to access. But your responsibility is not to make every person comfortable with your growth. Your responsibility is to be honest about the life you're trying to build. So the next time you feel that familiar pressure, that little voice telling you to say yes because saying no might disappoint someone, pause. You don't have to become cold. You don't have to become aggressive. You don't have to explain yourself for 20 minutes. You can simply ask yourself, am I saying yes because I genuinely want to? Or because I'm afraid of what will happen if I say no? That question can change a lot. Because sometimes the boundary you need isn't a boundary you announce to someone else. Sometimes it's a boundary you finally make with yourself. A promise that you won't keep abandoning your own needs just to maintain someone else's comfort. A promise that you will communicate before resentment builds. A promise that you will stop confusing being needed with being loved. A promise that you will stop measuring your worth by how much inconvenience you're willing to tolerate. And slowly, something changes. You become calmer, not because everyone around you changed, but because you no longer need everyone around you to behave perfectly for you to feel okay. You become clearer, you become more honest, you become more selective. And you begin to understand that real confidence isn't the ability to make everyone respect you. It's the ability to remain grounded even when someone doesn't. That's what boundaries ultimately give you, not control over other people, but control over your own participation. And once you understand that, you stop asking, how do I make them treat me better? And you start asking something much more powerful. What am I willing to participate in? That question puts your life back in your hands. Because you cannot control who disappoints you. You cannot control who misunderstands you. You cannot control who leaves. You cannot control who approves of your choices. But you can decide what you accept. You can decide what you return to. You can decide where your attention goes. You can decide what kind of treatment you keep making room for. And sometimes, the moment people begin respecting you more isn't the moment you finally become more impressive. It's the moment you quietly stop treating yourself as less important than everyone else. If this made you look at your relationships a little differently, stay curious about the psychology behind the way people think, connect, and behave. That's what we explore here at Next Mind Core. And remember, a boundary isn't a wall that says, you can't come close. It's a line that says, if you come close, this is how I deserve to be treated. And the people who truly value you won't need you to erase that line in order to stay.